predator becomes prey in the Florida Everglades as hundreds of hunters descend on the Sunshine State to catch and kill as many Burmese pythons as possible.
There is a hidden predator in Florida's marshes that gets frighteningly enormous, slithers silently, and leaves destruction in its wake. For years, the state's ambitious anti-python project has been combating these invasive snakes. But the most recent video shows something no one anticipated. Beyond simply capturing the enormous size of the pythons, cameras also show the startling fallout from their presence. Ecosystems are permanently changed. Native fauna disappears, and landscapes are stripped naked. A race against an uncontrollable force of nature is emerging from what began as an attempt to tame wildlife. Come along as we explore the terrifying truth captured by the cameras in this film. Number 7. The rise of the robo-rabbit. At this point, Florida's anti-python effort took a surprising turn. Following the conclusion of the Live Bait program, engineers and biologists collaborated to develop the ideal python decoy. The aroma of soft fur, the warmth of a small creature, and even the slight flicker of movement that reveals prey were all things they already knew these snakes were searching for. They began constructing something right out of science fiction with that template in mind. They dubbed it the Robo-Rabbit, and it was a true engineering marvel in addition to being witty. Each decoy was constructed from durable, weather-resistant materials and covered in synthetic fur that mimicked the Florida marshlands. A heating pad inside produced a steady temperature of roughly 99 degrees, which was almost identical to the body temperature of a real marsh rabbit. A unique chemical that resembled rabbit musk was emitted by battery-operated smell emitters, which drifted across the wetlands like the genuine thing. Even more sophisticated ones had tiny motors that twitched the nose and ears just enough to finish the illusion. These weren't toys. The construction of each one cost close to $4,000. The true secret, a motion-triggered camera and transmitter, was concealed deep within. The gadget would wake up and ping biologists sitting miles away, viewing live feeds from the marshes if something slithered close. For weeks at a time, the entire system was powered by tiny solar panels. The idea seemed straightforward. Put 120 robo-rabbits in safe enclosures in areas that are known to be hotspots for pythons. Instead of harming the snakes, the objective was to entice them into areas under observation, so that skilled teams could intervene and eradicate them from the ecosystem. When the first units were sent, everything changed, even though nobody knew if it would be successful. The first 2 days were breathtaking. Alerts kept coming in. Amazing footage of enormous pythons, some of which were over 15 feet. Long gliding toward the decoys was obtained by cameras. They tested the air by flicking their tongues to detect aroma and heat. Then they attacked, wrapping their bodies around what they believed to be a simple meal. As the crews charged in, they caught snake after snake. Up until day 3, it was functioning better than anyone had anticipated. At that point, a unit close to a deep canal sent a ping to the system. The biologist thought it was just another python. However, the figure on the screen when the feed appeared was a 12-foot alligator, moving through the water like a black, living log rather than a snake. It wasn't confused either. The heat of a struggling animal, the smell of musk, and the twitch of fictitious movement were all signs that drew it in. The gator lunged with an enormous burst of water. The $4,000 robot was smashed in a single bite, when it struck the pen with such force that the entire frame trembled. Everyone became aware of the issue at that point. The decoys attracted everything, not only pythons. The point that no one ever brings up is that alligators and pythons were formerly adversaries. They battle over land, food, as well as power. Humans had unintentionally started something wild by dispersing hundreds of delectable meals over their common hunting areas. Not only did the ideal bait attract predators, but it also started a predator war. Even though these robots didn't taste very good, Alligators soon discovered that they were easy prey. They started looking for them and eliminating them. Pythons began completely avoiding the locations when they noticed the larger gators hiding around the traps. Nearly instantly, the entire enterprise fell apart. The pricey devices were being crushed. The alligators appeared to be having far too much fun destroying government machinery, and the pythons were no longer falling for the ruse. However, despite the fact that everything appeared to be falling apart, the robots were concealing a secret that no one anticipated. So, what did they do to try to solve the snake difficulties prior to the development of the ideal decoy to entice the snakes? Let's investigate. Number 6. The dogs who could smell the invisible wildlife. Managers understood they needed a new type of hunter that didn't rely on luck. Flashlights or keen vision when Florida's reward programs just scratched the surface of the python infestation. They required a species with instincts that predate civilization. At that point, they turned to the dog, humanity's oldest survival partner. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission conducted a daring experiment with just 2 dogs who had received the same level of training as top investigators. Their task was to track a python by scent alone, which was straightforward but practically impossible for a human. Eleanor and Truman were their names. The kind of black Labrador you might expect to see playing fetch in a suburban park. Truman has a gentle, amiable face. Eleanor was a Dutch shepherd who conducted herself with poise and accuracy. Her eyes were piercing and focused. For several months, they were trained to recognize a single scent of faint, musky trail left by a Burmese python. It is completely odorless to humans. However, long after the snake has gone, it remains in the grass, dirt, and swamp water, leaving a spectral trail that only a skilled nose can detect. The outcomes were nearly instantaneous after Truman and Eleanor took the field. The two assisted in the capture of multiple huge pythons that had eluded human search teams for weeks in a matter of months. Among handlers, their movements gained notoriety. Truman's tail would stiffen. Eleanor would bow her head. The common signal indicating the prey was close is to slowly circle and then freeze. A flashlight beam would show the shimmer of patterned scales moving in the undergrowth a few seconds later. Where teams of professionals had spent hours searching, these dogs were finding pythons in minutes. However, there is always a cost associated with success in the Everglades. Working in the swamp is harsh. The humidity feels like a thick blanket as summertime temperatures rise above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. To prevent the sawgrass from cutting their paws, Truman and Eleanor had to wear special boots and cooling vests. And there was danger everywhere they went. Deep mud pits that could swallow a person, poisonous cottonmouths coiled in the grass, and alligators hidden in the water. Entire. However, neither the heat nor the predators posed the greatest threat. Scale was the reason. The Everglades span 1.5 million acres. Even though they were just 2 canines, Truman and Eleanor were amazing. Florida would need hundreds of dog teams, each requiring months of training, ongoing care, and costly equipment in order to adequately cover the Everglades. It wasn't a solution, but it was a breakthrough. Nevertheless, the dogs demonstrated one indisputable fact. Smell was crucial. What if scientists were able to reverse the notion that Truman and Eleanor could follow pythons solely by scent? What if the snakes were attracted to the hunters rather than the other way around? The answer to that query pushed scientists down a path for which they were unprepared, and blurred the distinction between desperation and invention. A python's natural prey, marsh rabbits, were used in tiny, carefully monitored experiments at first. The rabbits were kept physically safe in sturdy, protected enclosures, and their presence released the sounds and smells that pythons naturally gravitate toward. It had an instant and unnerving effect. The bunnies turned into irresistible magnets, terrified yet uninjured. In a matter of weeks, enormous pythons started to show up in the vicinity of the enclosures, one after another, attracted by the distinct smell of prey. The idea was validated by the experiment. Prey attraction was effective. However, the pictures revealed a different narrative, with shaking rabbits encircled by enormous constrictors. Almost immediately, outrage broke out. The trials were condemned as cruel and inhumane by animal welfare organizations. Because of the intense outcry, funding was withheld and the live bait experiment was completely discontinued. Live animals were prohibited in Florida. It would not be permitted by the public. What next transpired following the robotics project? To find out, keep watching. Number 5. The robot's hidden benefit. By the time the robotic rabbit experiment failed, everyone was prepared to give up. Millions of dollars were practically crushed in the teeth of enormous reptiles as the decoys became pricey chew toys for alligators. The application seemed like a complete catastrophe. However, young data analysts discovered something that no one else had thought to look at just as the team was about to shut everything down. The robots served as witnesses in addition to being lures. Since their deployment, every robo-rabbit has been surreptitiously collecting data. Its tiny cameras, infrared imaging, and motion sensors did more than just capture attacks. Everything that moved in the area was documented, including birds, alligators, pythons, and even changes in the water and wind. Hours and hours of unaltered data, including timestamps, temperature variations, predator routes, and movement direction were recorded by even the unattacked decoys. Each piece of knowledge appeared to be worthless on its own. However, a startling trend started to show when the analyst began cross-referencing all 120 units together, particularly the ones who survived long enough to submit entire logs. Like puzzle pieces of a world no one had ever seen before, the pieces fit together. The group created a three-dimensional computer map of predator activity in the Everglades using the data. The room became silent as soon as the visuals loaded. The pythons weren't mindlessly roaming over more than 1 million acres of marsh. They were traveling along paths, secret passageways through sawgrass and water that served as covert highways connecting their areas for hunting. With startling accuracy, the alligators were using the same passageways, occasionally overlapping and occasionally avoiding one another. It was a living, breathing network of predators that had been there for a very long time before anyone gave it much thought. At that point, the narrative transitioned directly into science fiction. Every heat signature, twitch, unsuccessful attack, and crushed robot was all fed into a potent learning AI by the scientists. Finding patterns that people couldn't possibly recognize was the straightforward objective. The team was astounded by the deep and intricate connections the algorithms made as the system digested the data. The AI did more than only find the hiding places of pythons. It began forecasting their location and time. Why? Because it had discovered the one thing that no one had noticed. The pythons were moving in precise, purposeful patterns meant to evade the alligator, their sole actual threat. The AI did more than just map the movements of snakes. It involved deciphering python psychology, including their habits, phobias, and hidden life rhythms. The mechanical bunnies had unintentionally opened the door for the python invasion. The whole hidden schedule of the species, including when they traveled, where they hunted, how they snuck across regions, and which routes they avoided at all costs, had been mapped. Scientists discovered the python's greatest vulnerability for the first time. After obtaining this ghost map, things abruptly altered. The previous tactic of waiting at decoy sites was abandoned by the hunters. That strategy was outdated. Rather, they employed the AI's forecasts to directly intercept snakes on their secret routes, the routes pythons took, when they believed no one was looking. The outcomes were startling and instantaneous. Lone snakes were no longer being discovered by hunters. They were discovering groups traveling along the same paths in bunches. The largest secret of all was then revealed by the AI, which tracked the snakes directly back to their safest spots by examining the motions of huge, mature females. It discovered its nesting grounds. The teams found enormous nests with dozens of females and hundreds upon thousands of eggs deep in areas of the marsh that no human had ever found. The scale was practically unbelievable. After utilizing the AI's assistance for just 1 month, more invasive pythons were eliminated by hunters than during the bounty program's whole preceding year. This breakthrough was a result of numerous failed hunts, broken robots, and crushed $4,000 decoys. There was more to the artificial bunnies than just bait. They had unintentionally played a crucial role in bringing the invasion to an end. They did more than simply alter the battle. The conflict was altered by them. However, what other strategies did Florida employ to manage their python issue? To find out, keep watching. Number 4. The invisible weapon Florida attempted to control its burgeoning Burmese python population for years using all the traditional techniques. They employed hunters, placed numerous traps, offered large bounties, and even fitted caught snakes with sophisticated trackers to keep tabs on their whereabouts. However, the pythons continued to spread regardless of what they did. One sad reality emerged by the early 2000s. Taking them one at a time would never be sufficient. These snakes were adept at surviving. They could disappear into the marsh like ghosts, multiply rapidly, and mix in seamlessly with the wetland landscape. A group of scientists came up with a much more audacious and contentious notion as a result of that realization. It sounded straightforward on paper, but was revolutionary in actuality. What if the fight took place inside their bodies rather than attempting to combat the snakes from the outside? This brought researchers directly into the realm of microscopic parasites, bacteria, and virusistini, invisible entities that have the power to weaken or kill an animal. The idea was audacious: discover, alter, or create a biological toxin that would specifically target Burmese pythons, while sparing all other creatures that coexist with the Everglades. That was the rule that could not be compromised. Nothing else could be impacted, including birds, panthers, alligators, and native snakes. The stakes were really high. Letting go of one of the riskiest strategies for managing wildlife is the use of biological weapons. There were harsh warnings throughout history. A virus known as myxomatosis was introduced in Australia to manage invasive rabbits. It was successful, but the ecology experienced unanticipated instability. The virus changed, and the rabbits suffered greatly. Nobody wanted Florida to be the next ecological cautionary story. However, the python issue was becoming a disaster that many thought could permanently alter the Everglades, because a single female python may lay more than 50 eggs at once. Its population was growing more quickly than traps and hunters could keep up. Florida ran the risk of irreversibly losing ground if it didn't do something daring and extreme. Thus, researchers moved forward carefully and slowly. A virus-like substance that could exclusively infect Burmese pythons was the subject of one proposal. The goal was to develop a substance that would weaken or kill snakes while sparing all other creatures. Using python's own DNA against it, a different team investigated genetic methods. Consider a snake that would be able to hunt, develop, and live normally, but would never be able to procreate. No infants, not a nest, not the following generation. Over time, the invasion would disperse without disturbing other species or overwhelming the Everglades with dead snakes. In many respects, it sounded like something from a futuristic thriller. However, when scientists examined the raw data, they found the dispersion over 1 ppb collagen growth and the ecological harm. They didn't see an end in sight beyond 5 million acres. Conventional tools were not only failing, but they were also losing ground. Nevertheless, there were terrifying risks associated with every concept. What would happen if the biological weapon changed? What would happen if it switched to a different species? What if the remedy turned into a brand new issue? These questions caused friction, disagreement, and ambiguity to permeate labs and meetings, slowing down the study at every stage. This drastic change in course demonstrated how hopeless the conflict had become. Traps, hunters, and technology were no longer the only tools used in Florida's fight against pythons. It was about to join the unseen battleground of biology, where a single error may have disastrous consequences. Everything. How did this novel approach to solving the python issue turn out? Watch this space to find out. Number 3. The release that changed everything. The scientific world was immediately divided by the novel concept. It was the state's last real chance, according to supporters. It was ecological Russian roulette, critics warned. However, the invasion of pythons was not slowing down, and desperation has the power to stifle hesitation. The choice was made in 2024. Florida gave its approval. The release. This wasn't a more extensive trapping program or a brand new bounty hunt. This time, the state went beyond what had ever been done in the python war by turning to science. A biological agent, a customized creature designed to prevent python reproduction from the inside out, was part of the proposal. The goal of the research was to prevent the snakes from reproducing rather than to hunt them.